Well, good morning, all. Today, we're going to talk about water, and we picked a lovely day to be discussing the topic. But there's kind of a reason. We like to get these classes in a relevant time frame. Watering is important enough that it shouldn't happen by chance and by guess, but there should be some sort of a plan. And so having these classes in the spring before the watering demand is really, really high is kind of our goal, so everybody can have a plan in place. Watering is one of those topics that is, at one hand, kind of simple and basic, and on the other hand, surprisingly complex. One of the issues with watering is that there really are not substantially great absolute rules. Every situation is different soils, different plants, different weather patterns and microclimates all make it different. So it is really challenging to come up with a direct calendar or such to say you water this plant here at this many days for this long every time. It's a more complex thing that needs a little bit more involved discussion and thought process and evaluation rather than a simple just do it. So keep in mind that different plants have substantially different watering needs, and that water behaves quite differently in different sites and situations, both like the difference between container soils and native soils, but also simply different types of native soil in different areas will change watering. So what I'm trying to get to here, our overall goals, is we want to make sure we're providing plants with the water they need, neither too much nor substantially too little. We want to apply that water in a smart and practical way. So we want to make sure this is minimizing our losses and waste of water. Water is a resource we shouldn't be wasting. And things like soil compaction runoff and evaporation into the atmosphere are not ideal uses of our water. And of course, we want to make this a simple and practical process so that you will actually do the watering that the plants need. I'll talk a little bit about water behavior in soils. So soil structure physically, the presence of biological material in the soil, and even to some extent the soil chemistry, all affect how the water behaves in the soil. Typically, on the simplest level, soil particle sizes, larger particles like sandy soils tend to allow water to move into, out of, and through them pretty readily. This means that it's easy to get water down to where you want it, but it's hard to make it stick around. On the other hand, soils with very, very fine particles, first clay soils, a good example, tend to hold water when it gets in and not allow it to move deep or laterally, and also tend to repel water, making it hard to get that penetration down into the soil in the first place. So when we have existing soils, we're often trying to amend them, to correct them, to make them behave better. And the easiest way to do that typically is to incorporate additional organic material. If you add organic material like compost into a sandy soil, that compost helps hold the water and helps mediate the release of that water. Adding organic material into a very fine particle soil creates gaps in pore structure in the soil, so the water can get through and get dispersed well within that soil zone. That being said, too much organic material can be a problem. Really thoroughly organic material soils can also repel water. They often beat up water on the outside until they get thoroughly saturated. Also, they sometimes hold too much water in place for too long. Much as clay soils do. So finding that balancing point between larger particle soils, smaller particle soils, and organic mass is one of the goals of soil amending. Generally speaking, if you've got a clay soil, which most of our immediate area is pretty clayey, you're going to need to put some organic material in, or you will never get the water down to where you need it, and it will never dry out for good use later in the season. All else being equal, the slower you apply water to the ground, the more narrow, but also the deeper it goes. Typically, the reverse is also true. The faster you put water on, the shallower it penetrates into the soil, but the broader area it covers. So to get your water down to where the plants will make use of it, down into the root zone, you'll need to find that point where you are watering long enough for good penetration, but also fast enough to expand to cover the available root zone of the plants. We'll talk a little bit more about that with watering and plants. So generally, with our heavier native soils, that's the typical problem, is getting the water on slow enough to get good penetration. On the other hand, really sharp draining soils, sandy soils, rocky soils, or many container mixes, water goes through it pretty fast. And so we need to make sure we're soaking the entire root area thoroughly enough to hydrate that soil and keep that moisture as available to the plants as possible. When we're talking about watering and plants, plants have some very specific water needs based on where they're from. And some plants are simply more adaptable than others. But generally speaking, the more niche of a tough environment those plants are in, the harder it is going to be for them to take adverse conditions. So plants from extremely desert environments do not tolerate large amounts of water well. Plants from swamps and wetlands do not tolerate drying out very well in general. So each individual plant has its specific needs. You really do need to kind of learn your plants, know what you've got and what their origins are, so you can give some idea on what their water demand is going to be. Too much water in many cases can be as bad or even worse than too little. The problem is seldom volumetric. It's not typically a situation where you're putting too much water on at once, except in soils that really hold that water for long periods of time. It's usually about frequency. Keeping plants constantly wet, unless they are adapted to a true wetland environment, can be very damaging. This is particularly true for trees and shrubs. Weather conditions have a significant impact on the plant's water usage. So windy days, plants lose a lot more water through their leaves, as they do on hot days. Humid days with fog, they lose a lot less. Some of those secondary considerations that we wouldn't normally think about as being particularly watering relevant play a significant role in some circumstances. For example, in the beach area, when you have those salty fogs and salt-laden wind, that dehydrates plants very substantially. And in the winter, when we have our cold winter in Western Oregon, our cold days are usually very clear, very dry days when the wind has shifted. We're getting continental air instead of coastal air. And that air is very dry, and a combination of the freezing temperatures, cold, dry air, and wind movement is extremely damaging for plants. And so even in the wet part of our season, sometimes plants need some supplemental irrigation to make sure they're not drying out from those weather conditions. Competition is also a significant factor in plant water needs. A tree standing alone in a bare soil environment doesn't stay standing alone for long. Communities of plants develop in around them according to availability of nutrients and water. And as those plants get established in, some of the more dominant or more aggressively water-seeking plants tend to often dominate the environment and take the water away from everything around them. This is why when you get out into dense woodland, there's a very limited group of plants that grows under the canopy of trees. It's not just about the shade, it's also about the competition for moisture as well as nutrients. So the denser the planting is in an intentional landscape, the more water and the more frequently you're going to need to water to make up for that water competition. Trees and shrubs. So applying water to trees and shrubs. The root systems of trees and shrubs are extensive breadth-wise and often deep, though for some species surprisingly shallow. This is very important. This makes it very important that we apply our water distributed around the entire circumference of the root system. A large tree, a 30-foot, 40-foot tree, any given part of the root system goes up the trunk and feeds somewhere up there a specific branch or sets of branches in that canopy. If we're not getting water on this part of the roots, even though we're getting water on this part of the roots, this linked branch structure may not be getting the water and nutrients it needs because of that. So it's very important to distribute that water evenly, or at least disperse it well. Trees and shrubs in general prefer infrequent deep watering. The branch structures and crowns, where the trunks or branches actually meet the soil, should be getting dried out between waterings for most species. There certainly are exceptions. And so if they don't, what happens is we develop disease organisms. And this is a chronic problem with some of our natives or other plants that are adapted to wet winter, dry summer environments in particular. Many, but not all, trees and shrubs prefer watering for a year or two while they're getting established after planting. And then they become relatively self-sufficient. It's not necessarily a thing to water mature trees and mature shrubs, except for species that definitely are adapted for wetter environments. So don't assume that all trees and shrubs need water for their entire lives. That being said, there's only a few trees and shrubs that do not tolerate watering in the summer after they're mature, but they're notable and worth learning so you don't make that mistake. So here's some examples in tree and shrub land about water needs. So a couple of common ones we run into a lot in the nursery specifically, arborvitae and western red cedar. Those are actually very thirsty plants. Even a mature 20-foot tall hedge of arborvitae never becomes really drought tolerant. Our dry season is intermittent and short enough that many times you can go for a year or two with kind of normal sporadic rainfall summers and never have a problem. And then we have a drought year or 2 or 3 dry summers in a row. And all of a sudden these hedges all over town start dying, or even very large western red cedar trees start dying because nobody watered them. They never become fully drought tolerant. Shallow rooted plants, rhododendrons and azaleas are a classic example of that. Often in many soil situations need or at least substantially benefit from summer irrigation. They don't have deep root systems like other trees and shrubs, so they can't find the water when all this upper surface water has gone away for the season. So they can't reach down there like a bigger tree or a deeper rooted shrub. So providing some additional irrigation, even if it's infrequent in the summer, is very beneficial. Hydrangeas are kind of similar. They're shallow-ish rooted, though not super shallow, but they are also from a relatively wet environment. They like some frequency of water. They take damage if they don't get nice, consistent water. A lot of fruit-producing trees and shrubs require or at least benefit substantially from summer watering. You know, you can water your apple orchard and it does improve your yield and your productivity and often your overall fruit quality. But you don't have to water your apple tree to get decent apples. Blueberries, you have to. They're, again, a relatively shallow-rooted plant. They need real consistent summer irrigation, and if they don't get it, they will either fail their crop this year or fail to grow and develop the flower buds they need for next year's crop. So blueberries and raspberries are particularly of note of being relatively thirsty plants. Ornamental roses, there's some variation in there, but for especially the large flowered hybrid roses, they need some consistency of irrigation in order to regrow and reflower. You can grow your rose bushes dry and they'll grow out in the spring and you'll get a good set of flowers and you head those back. You might get a second without irrigation, but you won't get the continuous rebloom through the summer unless they have a supply of water to keep them growing. So those kinds of factors matter as well. Of course, true wetland shrubs like willows are notorious for needing consistency of water. Even though they have pretty substantial root systems, they're very well adapted to very wet soils and they don't tolerate drying out very well. The other end of the spectrum include a lot of conifers, particularly pines and spruces. Not all, but the vast majority of pines and spruces are from rocky, dry, and elevated environments, not from wet soils. They do not need frequent watering. They actually often resent a lot of water. You put a dry climate pine tree on the edge of your lawn where it's getting watered frequently from the lawn irrigation. They often don't thrive really well. A lot of our natives and a lot of native shrubs from similarly Mediterranean climates, so like California species and some of the Mediterranean European species, many of them are supremely well adapted to a dry summer environment. They grow on the hips of the season, and then they really slow down in the dry season. And many of them will actually resent watering. You know, you can kill a full-grown Oregon white oak by watering it 2 or 3 times a week. They will not tolerate it. So know your species. Some classic examples of our natives that have problems this way are, of course, white oak and madrone, are native, but also other, particularly some of the California manzanitas, the California lilacs, ceanothus, rock roses from Mediterranean Europe, are all examples of plants that really don't want frequent watering. Many of them will tolerate intermittent summer watering, especially if you're in a really tough site or a younger plant you're trying to get established, but not the 2 to 3 times a week regular consistent watering. So know your plants, learn your species, learn their water tolerances. Even the trees and shrubs that like summer watering do best with very thorough but infrequent watering. So when we talk about infrequent, they're talking about watering once or twice a week with enough water to get good deep penetration. This is true in native soil environments. Typically, if you're planting trees and shrubs in structure in created soils, in raised beds or mounds where you've changed the soil structure, you may need to water intentionally more deep so that they will root through that amended soil and get down into some native soils that hold more water, or simply more frequent to keep that upper changed soil more consistently moisture available for those species. And of course, like any plant, trees or shrubs grown in containers, even very large containers, will need quite frequent watering, especially as they mature. When you get to the point where the pot is mostly roots and very little soil to hold moisture, you might need to water those once or twice a day in the heat of summer just to keep them alive. Again, that does vary from species to species and situation, but keep that in mind that containers need very frequent watering to manage. And this is why sometimes you'll find that plants that are otherwise drought tolerant simply don't do well in containers. You'd think they'd be fine because they tolerate drying out. But in practice, the frequency of water you have to put on to keep any moisture in that root zone is not good for their crowns and stems and can cause some severe disease problems. Perennials and herbs are only a little different. Most have slightly smaller and shallower root systems than trees and shrubs, but there are numerous exceptions to that. Generally speaking, because of that, water does not need to be spread as widely or as evenly around the periphery. So where trees have structural root systems that help provide the physical structure of the plant as well as providing nutrient and water accessibility, most perennials have more or less fibrous roots, and watering an area of that does a pretty good job of hydrating the vast majority of the plant. Exceptions include things like ground cover, where you have plants that are covering a wide surface area with shallow roots along that whole area. Those obviously need that water to be distributed, or they're not going to spread into those areas. Even though the root systems are not as large nor as deep, most perennials still prefer more thorough and less frequent watering to the point that that is practical. So typically, again, a couple of times a week is a good watering pattern in native soils for perennials. Most perennials, unlike most shrubs, will tolerate more frequent watering. There are certainly exceptions. Plants from desert climates or extremely arid non-desert climates don't tolerate frequent watering. Some plants with storage organs that go summer dormant. This is a common adaptation for perennials that are from dry summer areas. They grow, they flower, and then they go dormant. Bulbs are a good example. A number of those really don't like getting watered in the summer. So while you can companion plant daffodils, for example, in amongst your flower beds, and when the daffodils are done, put annuals and water them, not all bulbs are equally tolerant of that, and you do need to be a little bit aware of that. Many of our native bulbs in particular do not like summer water. Calicortus, a good example, erythronium, another good example. Watering them with any kind of frequency in the summer is actually quite bad for them. Some perennials and herbs that actually do prefer a very regular and consistent water include a batch of kind of wetland plants, delphiniums, astilbes, hibiscus, the big flowered hibiscus. Annual herbs, rather than the hardier perennial herbs, in many cases require some consistency of water as well. Cilantro and basil being good examples of that. Perennials and herbs that are much more drought tolerant are there's huge amounts of them, but some good examples: black-eyed Susan, a very hardy, showy flowered perennial that does quite well with no supplemental irrigation once it's established. Euphorbias from Mediterranean Europe, super hardy. The carnation family broadly, carnations and pinks. Herbs like rosemary and oregano can do quite well with zero supplemental irrigation in the summer. So in native soils, even though they like they have that smaller root system, you still want a pretty good consistency of watering. Infrequent, deeper. Once or twice a week in native soils is really a common watering practice. Perennials in mounds or raised beds will need more frequent watering. Very few, only from the ones from the most arid climates, have the ability to root through that modified or created soil down into native soil and deeper and find stored water deeper in the soil. And of course, perennials in containers need to be watered quite frequently, anywhere, depending on the species and the amount of soil in the container to hold water, might be several times a week or a couple of times a day if they're really root bound. Annuals and veggies do not, for the most part, develop much in the way of root system depth. There are, again, a few exceptions. So most annual plants, including most vegetable crops, need very consistent, regular watering. That being said, in my years of experience doing this in the garden center, I would say most people still overwater their gardens, their vegetable gardens, in the sense of watering too frequently. There are vegetables that are certainly suitable for dry gardening, for unirrigated gardening, when planted correctly in the appropriate situations. And just be aware that you can overwater. And again, the problem usually is frequency. If you're keeping your soil constantly wet, one of two things will happen. You will suffocate roots. Roots need oxygen. And if that soil is constantly water saturated, all the oxygen the air spaces get filled up and roots actually physically suffocate. But also, again, wet soils tend to breed a lot of soil-borne diseases, and this can rot out your plants pretty readily. So most annual plants, very regular watering for good performance. In native soil environments, this might mean every other day in the summer, at maybe at peak. Really typical for me, I use very well amended native soils for my vegetable garden. I'm watering every 2 or 3 days for most of the summer. During hot snaps, when we're getting there into the low 90s to low 100s, I bump that up to usually every other day. Even at 100 degrees, I usually don't water every day in the native soil vegetable garden. So annuals and vegetables, some examples of how this looks out for water need. There are annuals that have reasonable drought tolerance. A lot of them are from drier climates. Cleome, the spider plant, zinnias, osteospermum, the African daisies, and salvias, the sages, are all plants from relatively dry climates that actually tolerate getting reasonably dried out between waterings. I mentioned that some vegetable crops can be grown in suitable situations unirrigated. Tomatoes and potatoes, squash and kale are some of the best examples of that in appropriately sited locations with appropriately prepared soils, you can grow them with absolutely no summer irrigation in our area. So native soils, annuals and veggies, 2 to 3 times a week, maybe every other day, during real hot snaps is a good plan. Raised beds or created mounds, again, with those modified soils, they dry out in those interstitial areas, those transition zones between the soil and the air. The more of that you have, the more you're going to lose water to the environment. So they'll need more frequent watering every day to every other day. On a really hot snap, you might need to pick that up to a couple of times a day, but that's unusual even in a raised bed. Vegetables and annual flowers in containers need to be thoroughly watered daily or more frequently in most situations through the summer. So, and we hand water the nursery out here, so we're used to seeing this situation. But things that are really densely planted in a container, we'll often need a hot during hot weather, we'll need a watering in the morning and another watering in the evening to make sure they're thoroughly hydrated. But that does vary with the weather as well as the plants. Lawns are one of those constant love-hate topics in the gardening world. And lawns are almost always grown in some degree of amended native soil. So there's a lot less variables to talk about in lawns. Lawns have become kind of a scapegoat for poor watering practices, and that certainly can be the case. Different types of lawn grasses have differing levels of tolerating dryness, but none of them really do well on absolutely zero summer irrigation. A good rule of thumb for a turf is that 1 inch to 1.5 inches of water per week is enough to keep your lawn green and growing, as long as you are also fertilizing, mowing, and taking other appropriate care. You don't want to do that all at once, though. You don't want to try to set up a timer and put 1.5 inches of water, run your sprinklers for 3 hours once a week. That's not very effective because the grass only roots so deep and it's very, very dense. So it's competing with itself, so it can't really get down. On the other hand, you don't want to break that up into 14 10-minute spots of water every morning and every evening either, because you're only watering that top 1/2 inch of soil when you water like that. You're not getting any water down into the deeper areas of that root system to create a little more drought tolerance. So a good rule of thumb is 1 inch to 1.5 inches of water per week, and broken down into maybe 3 applications, like an every other day type of watering. The way to evaluate this is to take whatever irrigation device you're going to use to water your lawn, turn it on and put like a cat food or a tuna fish can out there, and just see how long that takes to fill up. That's 1 inch of water for your sprinkler applicator. So then take that time, divide it by 3, set up what days you want that to run, and let it roll. So there's nothing wrong, in fact, it's a laudable thing to let your lawn brown in the summer. This conserves water. Obviously, we use quite a bit of water with that 1.5 inches of water per week on your turf. But letting your lawn go completely brown and not watering it at all tends to promote disease and pest problems, and not result in a lawn that recovers really rapidly when the rain comes in the fall. So one of the things you want to keep in mind with lawns is that basically fall is spring for your lawn. Its natural growth pattern is to start growing when the rain comes in, to grow in the fall fairly aggressively, slow down with the cooler temperatures in the winter, but not go dormant, grow really fast again in the spring, and then just go dormant in the summer. That's what they try to do. That's the grass behavior pattern. So to have that lawn really ready to push vigorously and healthily again in the fall, just give it a little bit of water a couple of times over the summer. I like to just turn on the sprinkler out there for a good run, maybe once a month, to keep the soil from really drying out, and to keep as much of that root system happy as possible, so that when they get good conditions again, they can start growing. They've got a healthy root mass to draw upon. Okay, so that's kind of the types of plants you're going to be watering and some of this water specificity for them. Let's talk a little bit about how you're going to water. The important thing here, you get a lot of things about, don't water the foliage and water at night and what have you. It's really important that you take those things into account, but that you pick a watering time and technique that works for you. Because if it's too inconvenient, awkward, difficult, physically laborious, you're just not going to do it. So the first factor I would always say is make sure it's a watering technique that you can and will actually do. I would love to be able to put you a schedule together, but it's just too many variables. Every site and every situation is different. So the rules and schedules only go so far. So when we talked about in frequencies a little earlier in the talk here, those are kind of some guidelines. You're going to have to actually check and pay attention to what's happening. But there are some general principles we do try to follow in the majority of situations where it works. And those general principles are to water thoroughly and deeply, not frequently, as infrequently as the plants will allow. To try to water the soil and roots, not the foliage. That's not always practical in all situations. and to water when the water will be well absorbed and used by the plants and not wasted, which means early in the morning or late in the evening. There are advantages to watering early in the morning that don't apply in the evening. And the biggest advantage to watering early in the morning is that if you are putting water on the foliage through your irrigation practices, it will evaporate as the sun comes up and won't sit there on the leaves for long periods of time, because water sitting on the leaves can promote diseases just like water sitting around the crowns. Morning is great because cool air, pores are open on the plants. They'll actually absorb some moisture atmospherically. The water gets into the soil, sinks down into the soil before the air temperature gets high enough for evaporative losses to be significant. If you can't do the early morning, late evening is best after the sun is mostly down against, so that we're not wasting too much to evaporative losses. The drawbacks to the late evening is, especially in the heat of summer, air doesn't cool down that much that fast unless you're watering at 2 in the morning. You still have pretty warm air. Your evaporative losses are definitely higher than they would be in a morning application. The other thing is, as I mentioned earlier, the water sitting on the leaves for hours on end can promote some disease problems. So not such a big deal with drip systems, but it's something we would like to avoid. The worst time to water is in the hottest part of the day, because you lose a lot of the water through evaporative losses, and because water that does sit on the leaves as you apply it acts like a lens, and you can actually burn your leaves in a hot sunny day with water sitting on the leaf. Do use mulches, whether that's synthetic mulches like weed barrier fabrics, bark mulches, compost mulches. Those are great for letting the water get down into the soil and reducing the amount that gets lost again to the atmosphere. The criteria for that to work in most of your natural mulches don't have any real problems. The water does need to be able to kind of soak through it. Really chunky bark sometimes creates a problem with the water dispersing weird and not getting down. Synthetic mulches have to be breathable and water penetrable. So like sheet plastics are not great mulches, but those woven weed barrier fabrics work pretty well. Enough air and water gets through them for them to be fairly effective. So that being said, there's lots of different ways we can apply this water. All of them have strength. There's no one perfect way. All of them have strengths and drawbacks. And so let's talk about what your options are. Hand watering. It's watering with a hose, watering with a watering can, watering with a water wand. It can be done. We do the whole nursery, 2.5 acres of container plants that way. In many cases, it's not really efficient. It's hard to get enough water where you need it, and it often is irregular in how much water is getting to any given area. It's hard to get the water down, especially down deeper into the soil. So that being said, hand watering is really useful for small soil volumes like containers, where you're going to have to do it kind of frequently anyway, and each container in a group might need slightly different watering. Can also be used as a supplement to other established irrigation methods. For example, when you're planting new plants into an established landscape, you might be only watering that landscape once a week or twice a week, but those new plants planted in the warm part of the season might need some additional watering for a summer just to get them going. Rather than running that whole system more times, it might behoove you to just simply hand water. Or another good example of that is like starting seeds in the vegetable garden in the summer. Start your seeds in June or July for the fall and winter crops. And your regular scheduled irrigation in your vegetable garden is probably not going to keep that wet enough, consistently enough for good seed germination. Seeds do not tolerate drying out very well, and they have no depth to begin with. So those kinds of supplemental waterings are very useful for hand watering. So it's not like hand watering is bad, but it does take a lot of time and labor, and it has some limitations that have to be accounted for. So hand watering is great for containers. The problem with containers is that you can water them with drip systems and you can water them with sprinklers, but you're either often not wetting the whole root mass in that container, or you're throwing a lot of water outside of that container. The ability to hand water a container gives you the ability to really saturate that soil without having a lot of water going every which way. It's really difficult in our native soils to get water to penetrate with hand watering, but there are ways to do it. You take a hose with anything that breaks the stream a little bit. It can be a wand or it can be just a little breaker attachment. And you put that hose out there right adjacent to your root system of your tree or shrub you want to water, and you turn that hose on to where you're just getting a little bit of water out, and you walk away for an hour. Hour and a half will get that water on that very slow application like that soaked down in, and the breaker should give you enough dispersal to get at least a reasonable percentage of that root system watered. Doing it by a wand or by a hose, just standing out there and hand watering, you're unlikely to get your water deeper than an inch, couple of inches by hand watering. It just doesn't happen. It all just sheets up on top unless you spend hours on each plant just hand watering each month. So that's the challenge in native soils with the deeper rooted plants in particular. Hand watering can work in a raised bed. Using a watering wand on a raised bed is quite practical, but most people don't do it right. They just water, again, very briefly, watering an inch or so of soil, rather than spending the time going over the whole bed meticulously and carefully and very slowly, and then starting all over again, doing it all over again 2 or 3 times to make sure that water gets down deep enough into that bed. Doable, but maybe not practical for most people. Soaker hoses. There's 2 basic types of soaker hoses. There's dripping soaker hoses that act more like a drip system, and there's sprinkler hoses or spray hoses, which act more like a sprinkler. So dripping soaker hoses are not as precise as a drip system, but they do a really good job of producing a relatively lower volume of water, slowly dispersed over a good area and soaking down in. The sprayer types definitely are designed for shorter runs, and you can just basically treat them like a specialized type of sprinkler. It's important to understand that there's only so much water that goes into that hose at any given time, and that is dependent on the diameter of the hose itself, what the hose is made of, and the pressure behind it when it's coming in. So there's kind of a finite amount of water, and it's giving a certain amount of water is just getting lost through the sides. It's what it's supposed to do, is drop that water out, which means that there's a limit to how long you can go before you're simply out of water. This is why they're often designed to not connect together at all. So you buy the size of soaker hose you want, and you don't buy 2 or 3 and daisy chain them together, because you just don't have enough water to do that in most situations. So that's an important thing to keep into account. If you're running your hose on your backyard and your house goes through the house line on these little 1/2-inch pipelines like my house, you have less water than you think coming out of that 3/4-inch hose bib on the end. And so you have to be cautious about not getting water everywhere you think you are by laying out a soaker hose. Both types of soaker hoses have one major drawback in my humble opinion, and that is that none of them really last that long. You get a couple of years or a couple of, a few seasons out of them, and that's really all they're going to be good for before they either decay from sunlight exposure or simply plug up from sediment in the water. So dripping type soakers are really good for watering like a medium-sized perennial bed or a row, newly planted hedgerow or a rose garden, where you've got a very finite amount of space you're trying to cover, and you can kind of wiggle that hose around to make sure you're getting everything water well dispersed, and you can just run it as a single zone like that. It's worth noting that those dripper type soakers, it looks like you're watering an area, a few inches wide on top of the soil, but when you get down a foot into that soil, it is substantially wider. There's more watering happening than just where the hose is. That being said, it's not the entire area of the bed that gets watered this way. So you do need to keep those hoses at least relatively near and dispersed around the root systems of these plants to make sure you're getting enough exposure of water where the plant roots are. These types of soakers are designed for relatively long runs, 30, 40, 50 minutes, maybe up to an hour for good soaking down in. And as I mentioned, there's kind of limits on how many of them before you run out of water. Spray type soakers use a lot more water. They use water like a sprinkler does. Their only real advantage is being able to kind of design an area where they sit and where that sprinkling happens. Because of that, most sprinkler hoses do not usually have a connection at the other end, even to try daisy chaining multiple hoses together. They simply use too much water for that to be practical. We could give you rules for sprayer hoses, but really the practical thing is just treat them like a sprinkler, which we'll talk about next, and that's their method of application. So sprinklers are designed to put down a larger volume of water fast. It makes them really easy to automate. You set them up on a hose, you set a timer to it, and it just runs when you want it. But you need to place them where that water is going to go where you want it. And they can be difficult to get adjusted so you're only watering where you want the water, not watering completely outside the side of your house, your driveway, all of that. So they're imperfect in terms of their control of water application. Another issue with sprinklers, because of the relatively fast application in a lot of native soil environments, that water tends to bead up on the top and run off faster than it goes down in. So you may need to water in a couple of cycles, water for a while, take a pause, and then water again behind that so that we can get that water soaked deeper into the soil. In addition, because of the droplet style and impact style of watering, even a lighter mister type sprinkler has actual droplets that are actually hitting the ground from up high. They do tend to add to soil compaction over time. If you put a sprinkler with a specific setting on in a spot and you run that year over year over year, your soil does compact and settle just from the watering aspect of it, let alone any other traffic that's happening on it. So a caution you want to be aware of. So effective use of sprinklers. Sprinklers are great for very large to moderately large areas of really dense plantings where you really do want to water everything, not avoid spots where there might be weeds. Lawns, annual flower beds, vegetable gardens are quite suitable for sprinkler watering. Sprinklers are much less effective at watering trees and shrubs where you really want that depth of penetration. The problem with containers and small raised beds with sprinklers is simply a matter of efficiency. You don't have every inch of your surface area covered with containers, and so the sprinkler falling into that, you're getting a lot of areas outside those containers that are getting watered. And similarly, in a smaller raised bed, you're not going to be able to fine-tune a sprinkler to the point where you're only watering the raised bed and not watering all the paths around it. So efficiency suffers as a result. Really common to run a sprinkler system, 15 or 20, maybe 30, occasionally up to 40 minutes, depending on your soil and your crop. They're designed for shorter run times. So they put out enough water that running longer doesn't gain you much benefit. Drip systems have some substantial advantages, but they're certainly not the only way to water well. Drip systems provide a relatively degree of precision. You have a pretty good idea of exactly how much water is going exactly where you're putting it. The water is applied slow and deep into the soil, not to the leaves, which is another advantage. Drip systems are designed to be automated. You can, of course, run them manually, but it's very easy to automate. But they are relatively expensive to set up. You've got to set up a separate timer zone for each different type of watering you're doing. If you've got things that need a lot more frequent watering, that's a zone. Things that need less frequent watering is a separate zone. There are numerous components, timers and attachments and supply tubing and then distribution tubing out to the individual spots you're releasing the water. So there's a lot of parts to accumulate and there's some dollars involved. One of the biggest drawbacks to using drip systems in high density and annual plantings is that every time you change up your planting layout, you kind of have to change up your drip layout too. So every season involves a certain amount of pulling emitters, replacing them with plugs or replacing them with new emitters, changing the length of tubing and getting things so that the water is going where you want it because you're not watering the whole thing. You're very precisely putting water in specific spots. And a hidden drawback to drip systems that you'll notice after a couple of years in particular is it's hard to see if something's going wrong. You know, with a sprinkler, if something's not running, it's really obvious what's getting wet and what's not. Even a soaker hose, you use a pretty good band of water. It's pretty visible if it's getting plugged and a section's not getting water. Drippers, because your surface application only looks like about an inch or so of water, you don't always notice if a dripper is no longer working. And you can go days or weeks without realizing, oh, this dripper is no longer working. This plant's not getting any water, and often until some sort of symptom develops. So it is worth paying some extra attention when you're counting on drip systems to do your watering. So there's several different drip components or application devices, and they all behave just slightly differently. Individual drip emitters water slow and deep. As I mentioned, you look at something that looks like you're watering about an inch or so on the water surface, but you get down a foot and that's 6 or 8 inches or sometimes wider across as you get down deeper into the soil. There are different volumes of emitters available. Common ones are like ½ gallon per hour, 1 gallon per hour, 2 gallon per hour. And so you can kind of fine tune a system somewhat if plants do not have absolutely identical needs. So if you want to put your average need plant on 1 gallon per hour emitters and plants that actually like a little less water on ½ gallon per hour emitters, and more thirsty plants on 2 gallon per hour emitters or multiple emitters instead, you can often run that whole zone as one timer zone and just fine tune it that way. Larger plants, trees and shrubs, really large perennials, often need more than one emitter because, again, an emitter is only watering a very discrete area of soil. If you've got a shrub here and you're watering here, you at least need another emitter on the other side to do that. So like my rose garden at home typically has, each rose has a pair of emitters, but a larger shrub that needed that kind of water might need several emitters dispersed around the perimeter to make sure it's getting adequate water everywhere. Typically, you put the drip emitter in the main supply tube, and you've got some distribution tubing that runs out then to the plant. This is fine for what it is, and you mulch over it, and then it's not so much in the way. But if you don't mulch over it, it's somewhat of a trip hazard. If you walk through that area, it's there above ground. It's this tubing sitting everywhere. Yes, you can staple them down, keep them somewhat confined, but there definitely are some limits to the fun in drip system application. Dripper lines are simply individual drip emitters put together in a 1/4 inch line at fixed intervals, or occasionally in a ½ inch supply line too, though we don't use a lot of those ourselves. So you can typically are about a ½ gallon per hour emitter, and they're usually at either a 6 inch or a 12 inch interval. So if you lay out a section of dripper line with a 6 inch interval, you're essentially creating a solid band of water wherever that hose goes, and at root depth, 8 or 10 inches under soil, those all overlap together. So you get a solid band about 7 or 8 inches wide in the root zone. If you're using 12-inch interval, you have actual gaps between at normal soils and normal run times. So you run your dripper line with 12-inch intervals, and you have a spot of water. It's about 8 to 10 inches, maybe 12 inches across, and then a little bit of a gap, and then another spot where that other emitter is. That becomes very important for layout, and you can select your tubing intervals depending on what you're watering, how dense you want that water. Now, a ½ gallon per hour. Wonderful concept. You've got about 200 to maybe 300 gallons per hour available in your total zone. This is very typical for a drip system with some caveats. But by the time you actually neck this down to a 1/4 inch tube, your device that connects this dripper line to your main supply tube restricts the amount of water coming in. So you really have more like 20 or 25 gallons per hour available. At a ½ gallon per hour emitter every 6 inches, that means you've got about 10 to 12 feet you can run before you're out of water. This limits the use of dripper line for larger applications, and that's why there is ½ inch dripper line. That problem goes away for ½ inch dripper line, but you're actually running big tube for all that. We use ½ inch dripper line sometimes for, again, hedges or for ground covers that are often spaced around 1.5 feet apart anyway. So there are applications for that, and those can run much longer distances, but that 1/4 inch tube has some definite limits to how much water you can put into it, given the fact that you've already reduced pressure to run the drip system. And just like the individual drippers, the dripper lines go quite a bit wider underground than they do on the soil surface. Micro sprayers are little miniature sprinklers that can be connected by drip system components. They are more adjustable than a typical sprinkler, covering much smaller areas each. And so they have some ability to fine tune that water application a bit. They use much less water than a standard sprinkler, but a lot more than actual drip components. Like a regular sprinkler, the micro sprayers do tend to put water on the leaf surface. So that is something of a drawback, but they're very effective at covering medium-sized distances. Now, there are some inherent limits to micro sprayers. First limits are volume of water used. So mentioned a moment ago, you probably have around 300 gallons per hour in your total system layout on a drip system. Each of these sprayers, depending on which angle of sprayer, you get half circle, a quarter circle, full circle, and how wide open you have them, if you're running full bore or bringing them into smaller diameters, might run anywhere from 5 or 6 to maybe 15 to 20 or even as much as 25 gallons per hour. Well, if you got 300 gallons per hour total in your system, you're running 25 gallons per hour per sprayer, you've got maybe 12 sprayers you could use if they're running the maximum type of sprayer you can use before you're out of water and you have to set up another zone. That's a very practical limitation. I do this in my vegetable garden at home, and my big vegetable garden takes 3 separate timer zones to run because you only have that much water in any given timer. Typically, you're not running them quite wide open, and 10 to 12 to 15 sprayers is a real common on an application. There's a lot of parts involved. You typically connect a barb into your tubing. You run some 1/4-inch line out to a stake and riser that the sprayer sits on. But they're a really good way to use a sprinkler-like higher rate water with a little more precision. So individual emitter or 2 can provide water to a shrub or a perennial, maybe 3 or 4 on a larger shrub or a tree, with very little waste and loss. You got about 200 to 300 individual emitters is really common on a system, and they're designed to run for 40, 50, 60 minutes or so. Dripper lines run similar lengths of time, and 10 to 20 feet of row at a time is the maximum. But if you're running 20 feet of row, you can run 10, 15 lines of 20-foot row on one timer zone. You have enough water for that. Besides doing these for row crops and vegetables and for densely planted annuals in small to medium beds, dripper lines have 2 other significant applications. We may use them to make a collar around a larger tree or shrub, so that we're using just like using 6 or 7 emitters on a larger plant, but you're just doing it as one coil of tubing. It makes it very fast and easy to set up. The other thing is for drip watering a container. Individual drippers usually do a very poor job of watering containers because your water isn't getting dispersed throughout the entire soil mass. The water tends to go down and right through that loose soil, those potting soils, and right out the bottom without getting a thorough soaking. By using a coil of dripper lines or a pigtail of dripper lines, you can actually spread that water much more evenly around the container if you want to use drippers in a container for any reason. And then the micro sprayers are used more like sprinklers, and unlike other drip components, these are short runs. We're typically running these 10 or 15, maybe 20 minutes on a micro sprayer zone. That's one of the reasons you really shouldn't be using micro sprayers and other types of drip components on the same zones. They're really designed for different run times. Okay, so that's watering application methods. Let's talk just a little bit about overall strategies. And the first thing I will say, and I said it a couple of times during this talk, research your plants, know what you have in the ground, know what they prefer and what they'll tolerate. This will go a long way to making your watering efficient and less of a headache. Where practical, and it's not always, if you group plants together that have relatively similar water needs, it makes your watering much easier. You can set things up as zones or areas with one type of watering without having to nitpick each individual plant's applications. There's no great perfect method for figuring out the frequency and runtime for any given situation. There's going to be some trial and error. You're going to have to actually pay some attention, go out and check. It's complicated. So a good rule of thumb is to try to water thoroughly at least once And then go out and check periodically. Are the plants showing wilt symptoms? Is the soil still damp on the surface? Is the soil still damp at, 1 knuckle depth, 3/4 to 1 inch? Those are, knowing how long that takes in your specific site will go a long way to helping you fine tune your own specific calendar of watering. But there's no substitute for actually getting out and checking the plants and checking the soil and making sure you know what's happening out there, at least enough to have developed a routine. Do pay some attention to weather forecasts, whether that's freeze events or sudden heat waves, things like that. Our weather services are not perfect, but they can help you at least give you some guidelines. A couple of specific notes. Rainfall is sporadic in the late spring. So like we're on a kind of a rainy day now, and most in-soil plants are getting enough water from this rain. But plants in containers are probably actually not getting enough saturation through to be fully watered, given the type of rainfall patterns we're seeing right now. So be aware of that. The other one I want to really point out is freezing weather in the winter. So plants that are not already saturated from weeks of rainy weather, like plants in containers that are back under the soffit or on the deck, for example, if we have a freeze warning coming up, or we're going to be really cold, below 20 degrees or so, that's going to be a dry cold. And knowing that that's coming, you can take some steps to reduce your plant damage by going out a day or two ahead of that anticipated freeze and watering anything that's dry. Getting that water down into that root zone will dramatically reduce the damage from dry freezing weather. Not perfect, but it helps. You can't do the same thing after that freeze has started. Once that soil has frozen, you have to wait for a thaw before you can get any water down into that root zone. It just goes right across the soil surface where that soil is all frozen together. So you can reduce some damage by watering if you're paying attention to those weather forecasts. And yeah, as I mentioned earlier, water early in the morning to benefit from the cool temperatures and the sun drying the foliage and lack of evaporative losses. Frequency and timing and duration will vary a lot from plant to plant, from soil to soil. There's no substitute for really getting out and looking at your plants. Bear in mind that watering depth really matters. That's why we talk about that a lot in this talk. Improve your watering depth. Sure, you can do slower applications of water for longer periods of time where that's practical, where that suits both the plants and your needs. But you can also improve that watering depth by doing multiple different runs. You can run your irrigation for 10 minutes, give it a half-hour break, and then run it for another 10 minutes. And that already saturated top layer soil, the new water goes right through and then perks its way down deeper and deeper. And that's often a good strategy for faster application methods to get some penetration depth for plants that benefit from that. Check the soil regularly at 1 inch depth for most plants. If soil's dry, they'll be in needing water. Get used to looking at your plants. One of the things that, as of course a professional industry, is I can walk the shrub yard out there and I can point over there and see those plants need water, even though they're not wilting yet. There are definite changes that happen in the plants on varying levels of drought stress. And you can learn to recognize that and head off problems before they get very difficult to fix. Here's some kind of examples of how this plays out for timing and frequency. So well-established vegetable plants, not just newly planted, in well-structured and amended native soils might want watering a couple of times a week. But the new plantings that go in the summer or newly seeded areas will often need water every day or every other day, just to make sure they're staying moist enough to establish. Very hardy, not thirsty trees and shrubs in native soil, you're watering once or twice a week for 2 or 3 years is probably all they need to get established. And if they're not thirsty trees and we have kind of a short duration of summer, they may not need supplemental water. Don't assume that just because you've got a plant in the soil it's going to need watering. Well-established hardy plants often don't here. On the other side of that, a window box, like a 1 foot by 4 foot window box, typically when you're doing annuals in containers, you plant them really, really dense, so you have a nice, pretty display and with no soil showing. Well, you've got competition, you've got small root zone, and you've got porous soil. Those are going to need to really frequent watering, often a couple of times a day during hot spells. desert succulent like a yucca or a red yucca, something along those lines, even in a small pot, you really want those to get significantly dried out between waterings. They resent being kept moist. They're used to drying out between waterings. But plants from a wetland or a swamp environment, like a Western spirea or some of the shrub willows, if they don't go summer dormant, they'll need water every day or every other day to keep them alive. Rhodies and azaleas and blueberries have shallow root systems, and even when fully mature, they'll benefit from watering once or twice a week, especially if you're going for production on your blueberries. And as I mentioned earlier at the outset, even a very mature arborvitae hedge with that dense planting, say 10 or 15, maybe 20 feet tall. If we're going through a dry summer, they'll want some water, even if it's only once or twice a month, just to keep them from suffering severe drought stress. They do not tolerate it well. So kind of sum up the talk here. Where possible and practical, water the soil, not the foliage, in the coolest part of the day, thoroughly and deeply, and avoiding putting water outside of the desired plant's root zones. Know your plants, know what to expect of them so you can fine-tune your watering for the individual needs of your specific plants you're growing, and try to apply that water based on the needs of those plants in conjunction with what your soil situation is, because it's not going to be the same everywhere, even within your own yard. Then choose a watering method that works for you and for the plants. The worst method of watering is one that you will not do, and the best method of watering is one you will actually and consistently do to provide for plant health. All right, well, I thank you all for attending, and you can unmute or type in the chat. I would entertain any questions you have.
Hey, Darren, can you go back to the slide that the herbs and perennials and the different, you had some examples.
Yes, so some examples, and this is by no means exhaustive or anything like that, but here's some examples, yeah, of some perennials that on the left-hand side really prefer regular consistent water. On the right-hand side are substantially drought tolerant.
So how would you define shrub? I mean, I know most shrubs are perennials, but in this kind of context, like rosemary, I know it's a herb, but I would mean
Consider
some
it
of
more
the
of a
big ones.
shrub.
It's a shrub.
Yeah,
So
it's a
yeah.
shrublet if you get into that. No, there's okay, so talk botany, all trees and shrubs are perennial by definition as well. They're woody perennials. So there's definitely a fuzzy line between herbaceous perennials, evergreen herbaceous perennials, and woody perennials, subshrubs, shrubs. Rosemary is kind of one of those plants that kind of straddles the line. It's more of a shrub than not. Most people plant it and use it more like a perennial than they do like a shrub. So that's why I put it in this section.
Okay, gotcha. So, but shrub is basically anything that's kind of, yeah, it's got like a woody,
Yeah.
Obviously, yeah, okay.
Yeah, but it's definitely not a clear line, because like you look at peonies and there's fully herbaceous peonies and there's tree peonies which have woody stem pieces too.
Right.
And so it's not precise, and even the same thing we get into with tree. Is it a tree or is it a shrub? Well, there are some very strict technical definitions in botany, but yeah, where do magnolias fit?
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, cool. Awesome, thank you. Well, very good presentation. Appreciate it.
Very good, Dan. Thank you.
All right, take care.
Any other questions for me today? All right. Well, I appreciate your attendance. You guys know where to find me if you have any follow-up questions or anything else you need in garden. Thank you very much. Have a good day.